That was my research vessel and a small launch alongside that we built. And that's the launch, me in the tower there. This is one of the things we did on the reef for a while. We had a helium balloon with a basket under it on a tether where we could set up there 300 feet above the reef and just observe what's going on shallow reefs and movements of fish. And it was quite interesting. Here it is. See it up above the small boat there with a winch. And you could take two people up to that altitude and sit there for hours just watching. There was a photograph taken from it. And one of the dive scooters that we used on the outer reef on a calm day, the submarine that we had on deck. That's a little amphibious aircraft I built and carried on the boat for some years, where we could get aerial views of the reefs on nice days. There it is flying above the boat up there. And there's a shot from the thing with my boat in the background on the reef. For almost a half a century now, we've been hearing news items virtually every year about some threat to the barrier reef, some imminent threat to its existence, and pleas to save the barrier reef. But none of these things have ever manifested as anything other than a natural fluctuation of the environment. The reef itself is in fact in virtually pristine condition. Now, how did we get to this point where we have such a disconnect between reality and popular perception? I'll talk about that again in a minute, and something about what we might do about it. But first, to get into some of the major issues that affect landowners. One of the big claims is that there's been a huge increase in the amount of siltation because of human disturbance of the landform. Well, if we go back to when Captain Cook sailed up the coast, he remarked in his log every day of seeing numerous plumes of smoke over the mainland, and that was, of course, where the native people were burning off the land. It was the dry season, and they would burn areas every year. And that was a natural part of their stewardship of the land. It kept the country more open and grassy and easier to move around in and better to hunt in. And the early European settlers often remarked on the open park-like appearance of much of the land. Much of this area that was open parkland type country in the past, if it hasn't been developed for agricultural purposes or grazing, is now grown up into dense forest. We probably have more forest area today than we did back then. But one of the effects of burning off, of course, is that you leave the land barren, well, for a short time at least, and when they usually burn late in the dry season, and then the wet season would come and would turn green again. But the barrier reef, for example, they claim that, oh, we've got this huge increase in sedimentation. Well, that claim is based on a single study that was done looking at barium concentrations in coral skeletons on some of the islands and reefs off the mouth of the Herbert River. And there was a sudden jump about 1860. And that was when, shortly after the time when they first moved cattle into the Burdekin. And they moved about 60,000 head of cattle in. But previous to that, there had been a decade-long drought. And so the land that had been burned off before the drought didn't go green again because of the drought. And with that extended drought, when the drought finally broke, there was naturally a big flush of material and sediment and so forth into the ocean. So the barium may have come from that. But it might also, because most of the barrier reef area for most of the last 2.5 million years has been land. During the glacial cycles, when the sea level was lower, that whole area was a coastal plain. And the barium concentration may have just been in sediments laid down at any point in the past and stirred up by a local cyclone. We don't know, but what we do know is that that little spike in the barium, which they attribute to moving the cattle into the Burdekin, there were 60,000 head. Today there's over 1 million head in the Burdekin, and there's no spike in the barium. So that whole study is very dubious. But that conclusion from it, that there was this huge increase from moving the cattle in, has been the major basis for claiming that there's all this sedimentation going on. Well, I lived in the Daintree River for 20 years. I had a property on the river, and we get tremendous rainfall there, and there's large areas of undisturbed rainforest that's never been logged, and there are areas that have been logged. If you look at the sediment coming off of the undisturbed rainforest, because it's hilly country, in heavy rains, once the rain saturates the canopy, you get huge runoff, and you get large amounts of sedimentation. And that's perfectly natural. When the Belkey-Peterson government pushed that road through from Cape Tribulation to the Bloomfield River, and there was all the hysteria about how that was going to wreck the reef because of the sediment runoff and all. Well, one of the studies that was conducted after that, they put sediment traps above the road and below it, and they were going to show how much the sediment had increased. Well, the natural sediment coming out of undisturbed rainforest was so high that they couldn't detect any difference below the road. So the amount of, now if you take like the Daintree area where I spent a lot of time, there is one of the major branches of the river, Stewart Creek, was cleared for timber back in the late 1800s and then later used for cattle, and so it's all improved pasturage now. Now when you get heavy rains there, when it's draining off the pasture areas, it's clear water. The grass holds all the sediment in place, whereas the creek's coming out of the undisturbed rainforest because there's no ground cover. So there's a lot of nonsense going on about this increased sedimentation. And in fact, we have good reason to believe there's probably less sedimentation today than there was when the land was regularly being burned off during the dry season. Now, when we look at the ocean out here, of course, we've got sediments. The whole ocean floor in the inshore region is covered by tens of meters of sediments, but they've accumulated over the last 2.5, 3 million years since the beginning of the recent glacial cycles. And much of that has been laid down in the deep past. But every time the wind blows, the coastal water stirs up, and we know how turbid the coastal water is. So even if you do add some sediment to it, it's only the natural surface layer that's being stirred up, and any increase in turbidity on the reef is undetectable. Now you get these satellite images showing huge sediment plumes going out. Yes, they do, and it's coming from natural sources. And what you see in those aerial and satellite images, you'll see this big plume coming out, but what you don't see is that it's only in the upper surface of the water, because it's fresh water and it's less dense than the salt water and it sits on top. So you can have perfectly healthy reefs underneath it, and the sediment plume goes out, it disperses, and some of the sediment settles, but the same thing happens every time the wind blows, just from the natural sediments that are being stirred up. Now, if we look at other things like nitrates and phosphates, nutrients, that's another big bugaboo. They estimate that something like 6,000 tons of nitrate go into the Barrier Reef Lagoon per year from agricultural sources. Well, that's sort of dubious because about a third of the nitrogen that we put on our crops is oxidized and goes off into the atmosphere. Another third of it is taken up by the crops and harvested. And the other third goes into natural sinks and things. How much goes into the rivers, we don't really know. What we do know is that the nitrate and phosphate concentrations in the rivers are highest in the dry season, not when the wet season they dilute and go down. And in the dry season, the only runoff is from the headwaters, which are generally undisturbed areas. So it's not coming from agriculture. But in any case, if you took the full 6,000 tons they're estimating that went into the Barrier Reef Lagoon, the Barrier Reef Lagoon has a volume of about 10,000 cubic kilometers. Now, that's about 10 trillion tons of seawater. So if you put 6,000 tons of nitrate in it, it's less than 1 part per billion. It's undetectable. Meanwhile, on the outside of the reef, at the interface between the warmer upper layers of the ocean and the colder layers below, you get internal waves on that surface. And that deeper water is full of nutrients because no plants can grow down there. It's below the depth where enough sunlight goes. And those internal waves can come up on the outside of the reef, and they can create a nutrient flux that's an order of magnitude greater than anything coming off the land. And that's presumed to be beneficial to the reef. So why is a tenfold greater fluctuation from nature supposed to be beneficial, and this tiny percent that might come from the land is so harmful? Now, in fact, what comes from the land, even if you dumped it in all at once, it couldn't have a major effect on the reef, but it's not dumped in at once. It trickles in and fits in spurts as runoff happens. And the flushing time of the Barrier Reef Lagoon, depending on where you are, is 2 to 6 weeks. It's being flushed by open ocean water. So there's no possibility that those nutrients from the land are harming the actual reef. And if you try to measure them, once you get a kilometer or two from the river mouth, they're already, the increased amount of nutrients in the outflow from the rivers has already been taken up by the marine plankton, and it's back to background levels. So the effect from nitrates and phosphates from farming is practically non-existent. On top of that, in recent years, we've cut down on the use of agrochemicals generally, including fertilizers, because of their cost. We've learned to use them a lot more effectively and carefully. So it's a total non-problem. Now, as far as herbicides and pesticides go, the Barrier Reef water itself is near background levels for global concentration. You could find the same levels around Antarctica. You know, it isn't a problem that's being generated by the land. Now, right around the river mouths, yes, there's a bit of an increase in, I think it's one of the herbicides, but it's far below any level that's known to be harmful. And our assay techniques today are so sophisticated that we can detect the most minute concentrations that are orders of magnitude below any effect that is known to harm anything. And even there, for example, we detect dioxin, for example. Now that's a contaminant in 2,4-D and various herbicides and stuff, and that's thought to be harmful. But what is never mentioned is that dioxide doesn't just come from herbicides, it's also produced naturally in bushfires by the burning of organic material. And so much of what we can detect at those very minute levels probably comes from natural sources. When we look at across the spectrum of these various claims, we find that they simply don't hold up. We talk about other things like overfishing. Well, the harvest rate from the Barrier Reef line fishery is restricted to total harvest of 3,041 tons a year. Now that magical figure was the figure it was the actual catch in 1996 or 97 when they decided that we couldn't take any more without harming the reef. Well, that comes out to an annual harvest rate over the 350,000 square kilometers of reef and lagoon area of about 9 kilos per square kilometer per year, or 90 grams. In other words, a fish about that big, over a hectare, would be the maximum that we're actually allowed to take. Now, the environmental organizations themselves proudly tell us that well-managed coral reefs can sustain an annual harvest of 15,000 kilos per square kilometer per year. Now, that's not a ridiculous figure. That's 150 kilos per hectare, which is about like moderately good grazing land. And that's probably a reasonable figure. On a per hectare basis, that 150 kilos that you can take from a well-managed fishery, we're taking 90 grams. In other words, a fraction of 1%. Now, you might say, well, we want to protect the reef, so we'd rather have the reef than the fish it produces. But there's two things to think about with regard to that. One is that seafood has immense health benefits. We know from large-scale epidemiological studies and clinical studies that the reduction across a whole range of major health issues from diabetes and heart disease and a whole range of things there are substantial benefits from seafood consumption. And if we applied the benefits that are enjoyed in places like Japan, for example, to our own population, if we ate similar quantities of seafood, we would save billions and billions of dollars a year in health care and immensely increase the quality of life for millions of people. So it has an effect for everyone. It isn't just something that affects a few fishermen. Now, if we look broader, the number of primary producers across the spectrum, whether it's farmers, fishermen, grazers, or even small miners, their numbers have been reduced today to about a quarter of what they were about 3 or 4 decades ago. And one of the major reasons for that reduction has been just impossible environmental regulations that have driven more and more people off the land. And the end result has been, because these small producers are low overhead, family-run operations, and they kept our food prices down, supplied us with abundant, cheap food, and we had some of the cheapest, best food in the world. Now we have some of the most expensive food. The OECD did a survey a few years ago of food prices across OECD countries, and they looked at the previous 7 years of data, and there had been an average increase in food prices across OECD countries of 17% during that period. In Australia, it was 34%. It was double what it was in the OECD average. And that was about 5 years ago now that study was done. Since then, well, you know, all you got to do is go to the supermarket. Our prices are probably a third again what they were then. You know, they just keep going up. We have probably the most expensive food in the developed world today. And it's because of insane regulations has been a major factor in it. There's a whole range of other issues about the reef. For example, one of the threats is claimed to be this crown of thorns starfish, and that we're causing the population to increase because of runoff and so forth. Well, that's nonsense, because the crown of thorns starfish is found on reefs everywhere from East Africa and the Red Sea, right across the Indian Ocean, across the Pacific, all the way to the west coast of South America. And Their populations fluctuate widely, as do many other starfish and their relatives of the sea urchins. Their populations can fluctuate widely because they produce millions of offspring, tiny things that drift in the plankton and develop, and depending on the conditions in the plankton in a given year, their population can suddenly bloom. And there are population outbreaks everywhere, including oceanic islands all around the world, in which there's no possibility of runoff. Now, the starfish probably plays a useful role on the reef in that in areas where you have cyclones, such as we have on this coast, coral reefs, the shallower portions down to depths of 6 or 8 meters or more, periodically get wiped out by severe storms. And in the process of redevelopment, at first you've got algae and then soft corals, and then after 3 or 4 years you get big thickets of the fast-growing plate-like and branching acropora corals. And when they take over, the slower-growing head-forming corals are sort of overgrown by these faster-growing ones. And that situation maintains for a while. It looks great. There's all this colorful branching and plates of coral, but there's only a few species involved. And that's the time when if you get a population increase of starfish, because their preferred food is those branching and plate-like corals. And so they sort of prune that back and give the slower growing corals, which are sort of trapped underneath and being overshadowed, a chance to recover, and it reestablishes the coral diversity on the reef. So they probably play a vital role in maintaining coral diversity on the reef. But in any case, back in the 60s, when the crown of thorns first came to attention, one of the geologists from James Cook did some detailed work on the sediments on reefs, looking at taking cores of sediments and looking through them for the spines of the starfish. They have unique spines that are readily identified in the sediments. And he found that there were layers of them. They would vary because obviously these outbreaks were nothing new. They've been going on for ever since the reefs have been there, or ever since the starfish have been there. So there's nothing new about that, and it's probably beneficial. But in any case, you have all these different issues. Another one is, ship groundings and the damage they do to a reef. Well, they might disturb a few hectares of reef, once every 5 or 10 years a ship goes on the reef. But the cyclones happen every year, and they churn up and demolish tens of thousands of hectares of reef. It's a natural part of the cycle. They recover, and they recover just as quick from a ship grounding as they do from a cyclone. So it's really a non-problem. Incidentally, I have a web page and a Facebook page, but the web page has got links to dozens and dozens of the articles and things that I've written on these matters. If you're interested in it, just Google Walter Starck and you'll find a reference to my website. It's called www.goldendolphin.com. So if you look there, then you'll get a whole list of these articles and things, and you can have a look at more detail on a lot of this stuff.